The sight of a man crumbling at the fresh, turned earth beneath a gnarled oak tree stopped Nora Thorne in her tracks as she rode toward the outskirts of Grass Valley, California. The golden light of the June 1878 sunset, painting everything in shades of amber and blood orange. She had been returning from delivering medicine to the Peterson ranch, her saddlebags empty now, except for the few coins they had pressed into her palm, despite her protests. The work of a traveling nurse was never lucrative, but Nora had long ago stopped measuring her life's worth in gold. Her chestnut mare, Beatrice, slowed without command, sensing her rider's sudden tension as they approached the solitary figure hunched over what was clearly a grave, his shoulders shaking with the force of his grief. Nora knew she should keep riding. A man's sorrow was his own business, especially out here where privacy was one of the few things a person could claim. But something in the way he pressed his hands to the earth, in the raw sound of his weeping that carried across the quiet evening air, made her dismount. Her boots touched the dry California grass, and she tied Beatrice to a low branch before walking slowly toward him. He did not hear her approach, so consumed was he by his anguish. Up close, she could see he was young, perhaps her own age of 23 or maybe a year older, with dark hair that curled at his collar and a build that spoke of hard work and harder living. His hands were calloused and scarred, his clothes dusty from the trail, and beside the grave lay a worn saddle and bridle that had clearly seen better days. The grave itself was carefully tended. Someone had arranged smooth river stones around the perimeter, and a crude wooden marker bore words carved with painstaking care. Ranger, faithful to the end, gone but never forgotten. Nora knelt beside him in the dirt without thinking, her practical gray skirt spreading around her like a storm cloud. She said nothing at first, simply bowed her head and placed one hand on the sun-warmed earth, offering the kind of silent companionship that sometimes mattered more than any words ever could. The man's breath hitched. He turned his head slightly, and through his tears she saw eyes the color of mountain storms, gray and turbulent and beautiful in their devastation. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, two strangers bound by grief and the fading light of day. "I am sorry," he finally managed, his voice rough as sandpaper. "You should not have to see a grown man weeping like a child. Grief has no pride," Nora said softly. "And love has no shame. I can see you loved him very much." The man looked back at the grave, fresh tears cutting tracks through the dust on his face. "He was the best horse that ever lived. 13 years we had together. 13 years through every kind of weather and trouble. He carried me through a flood in Nevada, outran bandits in Arizona, and never once complained about the weight of my sorrows." His voice broke again. "Yesterday morning he was fine. By afternoon he was colicking something terrible, and by nightfall he was gone. The veterinarian said there was nothing to be done, that sometimes it just happens, but I keep thinking maybe if I had noticed sooner, maybe if I had not pushed him so hard last week when we rode from Sacramento." "Stop," Nora interrupted gently. She had seen this kind of guilt before, the way people tortured themselves with maybes and what-ifs when death came calling. "You gave him 13 good years. That is more than most horses ever know. The love was there. I can see it in how carefully you made this grave, in how your hands shake when you touch the earth where he lies. He knew he was loved, and that matters more than anything else." The man looked at her again, really looked at her this time, taking in her dark brown hair pinned sensibly back, her green eyes that held both kindness and steel, the medical bag still slung across her shoulder. "You are a healer," he said. "A nurse," Nora confirmed. "Not that it matters much." I work with people, not animals, though grief is grief no matter who we mourn. Xander Garrison, he said, extending a dirt-streaked hand. Most folks just call me Zan. Nora Thorne. She took his hand, noting the strength in his grip even now, the way his fingers were long and capable. I live in Grass Valley. Have a small house on the east side where I take patients when they need more care than a quick visit can provide. I know the town, Xander said, releasing her hand slowly. I have been working at the Holloway Ranch about 10 miles north. Or I was, until this morning when I told them I needed time to bury Ranger proper. They said if I left during workday hours not to bother coming back. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. Guess I am unemployed now. Then they were fools to let you go, Nora said firmly. Any man who loves his horse enough to lose work over giving him a proper burial is a man of character. You will find something else. Xander scrubbed at his face with his sleeve, trying to compose himself. The sun was sinking lower now, painting the sky in purples and deep golds. I should not keep you. I am sure you have somewhere to be. I am exactly where I need to be, Nora replied. She settled more comfortably in the dirt, arranging her skirts. Tell me about him. Tell me about Ranger. And so, as the light faded and the first stars began to prick through the darkening sky, Xander Garrison told her. He spoke of how he had bought Ranger as a yearling with money saved from 3 summers of ranch work when he was barely 16 years old. How the horse had been wild and half broken, but something in his eyes had called to Xander's soul. He described teaching Ranger to trust him, the long, patient hours of gentle words and careful handling, until the day came when he could ride without saddle or bridle, guided only by the pressure of his knees and the bond between them. He told her about the adventures they had shared, the narrow escapes and the long, lonely nights on the trail when Ranger's steady presence was the only thing keeping the darkness at bay. He spoke of how his parents had died of cholera when he was 17, how Ranger had been there through all of it, the one constant in a life that seemed determined to shift and change beneath his feet like desert sand. Nora listened to every word, asking questions when the silence stretched too long, offering observations that showed she truly heard him. She had learned long ago that sometimes the greatest gift you could give someone was simply to bear witness to their pain, to let them speak the unspeakable, and know they would not be judged for their tears. By the time Xander finished talking, full dark had fallen. The moon was rising, nearly full and bright enough to cast shadows. Nora's stomach growled softly, reminding her she had not eaten since morning, and she saw Xander's lips twitch in something that might have been the ghost of a smile. I have kept you far too long, he said. You must think me a fool, unburdening myself to a complete stranger. I think you a man who needed someone to listen, Nora corrected. She stood, brushing dirt from her skirts, and extended a hand to help him up. And we are not strangers anymore. Shared grief makes fast friends, my mother used to say. Xander took her hand and rose, taller than she had expected, broad-shouldered and lean. Will you let me walk you back to town? It is not safe for a woman alone after dark, and it is the least I can do after you gave me your evening. Nora should have said no. She had walked and ridden alone countless times, was known to be capable of handling herself, but something in Xander's eyes made her nod. I would appreciate the company. My horse is just over there. They walked together through the darkness, Nora leading Beatrice while Xander carried his saddle. He said he had been camping nearby, had not yet decided what to do or where to go now that the Holloway Ranch was no longer an option. Nora found herself suggesting, before she could think better of it, that he could stable his remaining possessions in the small barn behind her house until he figured out his next move. I could not impose, Xander protested, but she could hear the relief in his voice. "It is not an imposition. The barn is mostly empty anyway. I only have Beatrice and a few chickens. You would actually be doing me a favor. There is wood that needs splitting for winter, and the roof could use some patching before the fall rains come. If you were willing to do some work in exchange for a place to sleep and meals, we could call it even." It was impulsive, the kind of decision Nora rarely made, but something about this grieving cowboy touched something deep in her chest, something that had been dormant for a long time. Maybe it was the way he had loved his horse so completely. Maybe it was the vulnerability in his tears. Maybe it was simply that she recognized in him a kindred loneliness, the kind that came from losing the things and people you held most dear. Xander was quiet for a long time as they walked, the lights of Grass Valley growing closer. Finally he said, "You do not know me. I could be anyone." "You could," Nora agreed, "but you are not. You are a man who wept over his horse's grave and carved a marker with your own hands. You are a man who lost work because you refused to let duty trump love. That tells me enough." "You are either very wise or very foolish," Xander said, but there was warmth in his voice now, the first hint that he might someday smile again. "I have been called both," Nora admitted. "Often by the same people." They reached the outskirts of town as the church clock struck 9. Grass Valley was quiet this time of night, most folks already abed in preparation for early rising. Nora's house sat at the end of a narrow lane, a modest structure with whitewashed walls and a neat garden out front. The barn behind it was small but sturdy, and she showed Xander where he could store his things and make up a bed in the loft if he wanted. "There is a pump out back for water," she said, "and I will bring you some supper shortly. Nothing fancy, just leftover stew and bread, but it will fill your belly." "Miss Thorne," Xander said, and she turned back to find him watching her with an expression she could not quite read. "Thank you. For stopping, for staying, for this. I do not have words for what it means." "Then do not try to find them," Nora said softly. "Just rest. Tomorrow will come soon enough, and with it all the decisions that need making." She left him there in the barn and went into her house, lighting lamps and stirring up the fire in her stove. As she heated the stew and sliced bread, she found herself wondering what exactly she had done. Taking in a strange man was not like her, no matter how compelling his story. Her reputation in town was already precarious enough, a woman alone, unmarried at 23, doing work that brought her into contact with all manner of people at all hours. She did not need to give the gossips more ammunition. But when she carried a tray out to the barn and saw Xander sitting on a bale of hay, his face washed clean now, and his hands folded as if in prayer, she knew she had made the right choice. Some things transcended practicality and reputation. Some things were simply human kindness, the kind that cost nothing and meant everything. They ate together in companionable silence, and when Nora finally returned to her house, she found she was thinking not about the risk she had taken, but about the way Xander's voice had cracked when he spoke about Ranger, about the careful way he had carved that marker, about the storm gray of his eyes in the fading light. She slept better that night than she had in months, and if her dreams were full of cowboys and sunset and the sound of honest weeping, she did not mind at all. Morning came with the roosters, and Nora rose as she always did, washing quickly in the basin on her dresser and pinning her hair back before donning a simple blue calico dress. She had patience to see today old Mrs. Chen needed her bandages changed, and the Miller baby was due for a wellness check, but first she wanted to make sure Xander had everything he needed. She found him already awake and working, splitting wood in her backyard with an efficiency that spoke of years of practice. He had stripped down to his undershirt despite the morning chill, and she could see the play of muscles across his shoulders and back as the axe rose and fell. Sweat gleamed on his skin, and something in her chest tightened at the sight. "You did not have to start so early," she called, and he turned, wiping his forehead with his forearm. "Could not sleep," he admitted. "Figured I might as well make myself useful. I hope the noise did not wake you." "I am always up with the sun," Nora assured him. "Come inside and have breakfast." "You cannot work on an empty stomach." They ate eggs and toast at her small kitchen table, an intimacy to the domesticity that made Nora acutely aware of every movement, every breath. Xander had cleaned up, his dark hair still damp from washing, his face better composed than it had been last night, though sorrow still lingered in his eyes like shadows. "I have been thinking," he said as he finished his coffee, "about what comes next. I need to find work, and quickly. I have maybe $20 to my name, enough for a week or two if I am careful, but not much more than that." "The lumber mill is always hiring," Nora suggested. "And I heard the Johnsons are looking for someone to help with their cattle drive next month. Or if you are good with horses," she stopped, seeing him flinch. "I am sorry, that was thoughtless." "No," Xander said, shaking his head. "You are right. I am good with horses. It is what I know best. I just need time before I can face working with them again. Ranger is too fresh, too raw." "Then the mill," Nora decided. "I know the foreman. Good man named Bill Cooper. If I put in a word for you, he will likely give you a chance." "You have already done so much," Xander protested. "And I am willing to do a bit more," Nora said firmly. "Let me help, Xander." "You helped me last night, even if you do not realize it." He looked at her questioningly, and she found herself explaining something she had not meant to share. "I lost someone too. My fiancé, Thomas, 3 years ago. Pneumonia took him in less than a week. I had all the medical training in the world, and I could not save him. For a long time I thought I would drown in that grief, that I would never surface again. But I did, eventually. And last night, sitting with you at Ranger's grave, I remembered that grief is not something to be ashamed of. It is just love with nowhere to go. You reminded me of that, and I am grateful." Xander reached across the table and took her hand, his grip warm and solid. "Then we have helped each other," he said quietly. "And that is a good foundation for friendship, I think." "I think so too," Nora agreed. And for a moment they simply sat there, hands clasped, the morning light streaming through the window and painting everything gold. The next few weeks fell into a rhythm that surprised them both with its ease. Nora spoke to Bill Cooper, who agreed to give Xander a trial at the lumber mill. The work was hard and physical, the kind that left Xander exhausted at the end of each day, but he never complained. He would return to Nora's barn each evening, wash up at the pump, and then join her for supper. Those evening meals became the center of both their days. They would sit at her kitchen table and talk about everything and nothing, his childhood in Missouri, before his parents moved west, her training in San Francisco under a doctor who believed women could be just as capable as men in medicine, the books they had read, and the places they dreamed of seeing. Xander had a dry sense of humor that emerged slowly, like a flower opening, and Nora found herself laughing more than she had in years. He was also proving invaluable around her property. The wood was all split and neatly stacked within the first week. He patched the roof, fixed a loose board on her front steps, and built a proper coop for her chickens that was so well constructed, she suspected it would outlast the house itself. When she protested that he was working too hard, he simply shook his head and said it felt good to have purpose again, to be building instead of just drifting. The town noticed, of course. Grass Valley was small enough that everyone knew everyone else's business, and the presence of a handsome young man living in Nurse Thorne's barn became a popular topic of speculation. Nora weathered the gossip with the same calm practicality she brought to everything else, but she could see it bothered Xander. "I am causing you trouble," he said one evening after they had passed Mrs. Henderson on the street and received a look of such pointed disapproval that it could have curdled milk. "Maybe I should find somewhere else to stay." "You are not causing me anything I cannot handle," Nora said firmly. "Mrs. Henderson has been spreading gossip about me since I came to this town. If it is not you, it would be something else: my unmarried state, my work, the fact that I wear practical dresses instead of fashionable ones. I stopped trying to please that woman years ago." "Still," Xander said, but Nora cut him off. "Still nothing. You stay as long as you need to. Unless you want to leave, of course. I would never keep you here if you wanted to go." "I do not want to go," Xander said, so quickly and emphatically that they both paused, suddenly aware of what had been growing between them these past weeks. It hung in the air like smoke, visible but untouchable, this thing neither of them had been willing to name. Nora cleared her throat. "Well then, that is settled." But that night, lying in her bed while Xander slept in the barn, Nora found herself unable to ignore the truth any longer. She was falling in love with him. Maybe had been falling since that first evening when she knelt beside him at Ranger's grave. She loved the gentleness in his hands when he fixed things, the way he always asked about her patients and listened with genuine interest to her answers. She loved his quiet strength, the way grief had not hardened him but instead seemed to have opened him up, made him more empathetic to the struggles of others. She loved the way he looked at her sometimes when he thought she was not watching, as if she was something precious and unexpected. The realization terrified her. She had sworn after Thomas died that she would never open her heart like that again, never give someone the power to devastate her so completely. But Xander Garrison had slipped past her defenses without even trying, and now she was in too deep to escape unscathed. The question was whether he felt the same way, or if she was simply a kind stranger who had helped him through a dark time, someone he would eventually thank and leave behind when he was ready to move on. She got her answer sooner than expected. It was a Saturday in late July, the kind of scorching day where even the lizards sought shade. Nora had no patients scheduled, a rare gift of free time, and Xander had the day off from the mill. They decided to ride out to the swimming hole that fed off Clear Creek, a spot Nora had discovered shortly after moving to Grass Valley. The water was gloriously cool, fed by snowmelt from higher elevations. Nora had worn an old dress she did not mind getting wet, and she waded in up to her knees while Xander sat on the bank, his boots off and his feet dangling in the current. "You should come in," Nora called, splashing water in his direction. "When was the last time you actually cooled off properly?" "I am fine here," Xander said, but he was smiling, that rare full smile that transformed his whole face and made her heart stutter. "Coward," Nora teased, and then shrieked when he stood and waded in fully clothed, water soaking his trousers and shirt. He reached for her and she darted away, laughing, but he was faster. He caught her around the waist and they both went under, coming up sputtering and gasping. "You are insane," Nora gasped, shoving wet hair out of her face, but she was laughing too hard for it to sound like a real complaint. "You called me a coward," Xander pointed out. He was close enough now that she could see the water droplets caught in his eyelashes, the way his wet shirt clung to his chest and shoulders. "I had to defend my honor." "Your honor is intact," Nora assured him, but her voice came out breathier than she intended. They were still standing close, his hands on her waist, her palms pressed against his chest. The laughter faded, replaced by something heavier, more dangerous. "Nora," Xander said, and her name on his lips was a question and a prayer all at once. "Yes," she whispered, though she was not entirely sure what she was agreeing to. But then his mouth was on hers and nothing else mattered. The kiss was tentative at first, careful, as if he was afraid she might pull away. But Nora had spent too many nights thinking about this, wondering what it would feel like, and she was done with hesitation. She wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him back with 3 years of loneliness and longing, with all the feelings she had been trying so hard to ignore. Xander made a sound low in his throat and pulled her closer, one hand sliding up to cup the back of her head while the other remained at her waist. The creek flowed around them, indifferent to their revelation, and somewhere overhead a hawk called out to the blazing sky. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Xander rested his forehead against hers. "I have wanted to do that for weeks," he admitted. "But I did not know if you felt the same way. I did not want to presume after everything you have done for me." "I have wanted it too," Nora confessed. "I was just afraid of losing someone again, afraid that maybe I was just convenient, someone who was there when you needed help." "You are so much more than that," Xander said fiercely. He pulled back enough to look her in the eyes. "Nora, you brought me back from the darkest place I have ever been. That first night, I was not just grieving Ranger. I was questioning everything, why I keep going, what the point is when everything I love gets taken away. And then you knelt beside me in the dirt and stayed. You did not try to fix me or tell me to stop crying. You just stayed. And every day since then, you have shown me that there are still good things in this world, still reasons to keep waking up in the morning. I am falling in love with you. I think I have been since that first night." Tears sprang to Nora's eyes, but they were good tears, the kind that came from happiness too large to contain. "I am falling in love with you too," she said. "I fought it so hard, but I cannot fight it anymore. I do not want to." Xander kissed her again, softer this time, tender and full of promise. When they finally made their way back to shore, both thoroughly soaked and grinning like fools, everything felt different. The air was still scorching, the sun still merciless, but none of it mattered because they had each other. They rode back to town slowly, their hands clasped between their horses, neither wanting to let go even for a moment. When they reached Nora's house, Xander helped her down from Beatrice and then simply held her for a long moment, his chin resting on top of her head. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. "Now we figure it out together," Nora said, "one day at a time." "I like the sound of that," Xander said and kissed the top of her head. The weeks that followed were some of the happiest of Nora's life. She and Xander made no secret of their relationship, and while the gossips had plenty to say about it, Nora found she did not care. Let them talk. She had spent too many years living for other people's approval, trying to be respectable and proper and small. Loving Xander made her feel expansive, as if she was finally becoming the person she was meant to be. Xander continued working at the mill, and after 2 months, Bill Cooper offered him a permanent position with better pay. He was a good worker, never late and never complaining, and the other men respected his quiet competence. With steady income, Xander started talking about finding his own place, about not imposing on Nora's hospitality any longer. "What if I do not want you to leave?" Nora asked one evening in late September. They were sitting on her front steps watching the sunset, his arm around her shoulders and her head resting against his chest. "What are you saying?" Xander asked carefully. Nora took a deep breath. This was not how things were supposed to be done. The man was supposed to ask, supposed to make the grand gesture. But Nora had never been much for tradition, and she knew what she wanted. "I am saying marry me, Xander Garrison. Make an honest woman of me and stop sleeping in the barn. Move into the house with me and let us build a life together. We can start small, just the two of us, and see where it takes us." Xander was quiet for so long that Nora started to worry she had misread everything, that she had pushed too hard too fast. But then he shifted, sliding off the step and dropping to one knee in front of her, his hands taking hers. "Nora Thorne, I have nothing to offer you but a strong back and a heart that is completely yours. I do not have land or prospects or anything that would make me a sensible choice. But I love you more than I thought possible to love anyone. You have given me back my life, my hope, my future. So yes, I will marry you. I will marry you tomorrow if you will have me." "Tomorrow might be too soon," Nora said, laughing through happy tears. "But soon, very soon." They were married 6 weeks later in a small ceremony at the church in Grass Valley. Nora wore a simple cream-colored dress she had sewn herself, with wildflowers in her hair that Xander had picked that morning. His hands shook when he slid the plain gold band onto her finger, and his voice cracked on the vows, but Nora had never seen anything more beautiful. Bill Cooper stood as Xander's witness, and Dr. Margaret Chen, the elderly physician Nora sometimes assisted, stood as hers. The congregation was small, a few friends and neighbors who approved of the match, and several who came purely to satisfy their curiosity. Mrs. Henderson was notably absent, but Nora could not bring herself to care. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Xander kissed her with such tenderness that several women in the pews sighed audibly. Nora kissed him back, her hand coming up to cup his face, and thought that if she died in that moment she would die happy. They held a small reception at the house afterward, with food provided by friends and dancing in the yard to music from Ben Miller's fiddle. Xander proved to be a surprisingly good dancer, spinning Nora around the dusty yard until she was breathless and laughing. As the sun set and the lanterns were lit, he pulled her close for a slower dance, his lips near her ear. "Thank you," he whispered. "For what?" Nora asked. "For kneeling in the dirt beside a broken man, for staying, for seeing something in me worth loving." "Always," Nora promised. "I will always stay." That night, when the guests had finally departed and they were alone in the house that was now officially theirs together, Xander carried Nora over the threshold of the bedroom with ceremony that made her laugh. He set her down gently, his hands coming up to cup her face. "Are you sure?" he asked, and she loved him even more for asking, for always thinking of her comfort first. "I have never been more sure of anything," Nora said, and drew him down into a kiss that quickly deepened. That led to fumbling with buttons and laces, to whispered endearments and gasping breaths. They came together with tenderness and passion, learning each other's bodies with the same careful attention they had brought to learning each other's hearts. Later, wrapped in blankets and each other, Xander traced idle patterns on Nora's shoulder. "I keep thinking about that first night," he said. "How close I came to not making that grave, to just leaving Ranger where he fell and riding away. If I had not stopped, if I had not stayed to bury him properly, we never would have met." "Then I am grateful you stopped," Nora said. "Grateful you loved him enough to do what was right, even when it hurt. That love brought you to me." "Maybe that is what love does," Xander mused. "Brings us to where we need to be, even through the grief and pain." "Maybe," Nora agreed and kissed his shoulder. "Or maybe we just got lucky." "I will take luck," Xander said. "Especially when it looks like you." Their first year of marriage was an adjustment, as all first years are, but Nora and Xander navigated it with the same care and communication they brought to everything else. They learned each other's habits and rhythms, figured out how to share space and make decisions together. Xander proved to be an excellent cook, something he had learned during his years on the trail, and he often had supper ready when Nora came home from long days visiting patients. Nora, in turn, helped Xander with his reading. He had basic literacy but had never had much formal education, and he was embarrassed by how slowly he worked through the newspapers and books Nora kept around the house. She spent evening after evening patiently working with him, never making him feel stupid or inadequate, and by their first anniversary he was reading with real fluency. "You have given me so much," Xander said one night, looking up from the novel he was engrossed in. "Not just the reading, but the confidence to try, to believe I can be more than just a ranch hand or mill worker." "You were always more than that," Nora said. "I just helped you see it." Money was tight that first year, as it is for most young couples starting out, but they made do. Nora's nursing brought in a modest but steady income, and Xander's work at the mill was reliable. They saved what they could, dreaming of eventually buying a small piece of land where they could build something of their own. In the spring of 1880, opportunity came from an unexpected direction. Dr. Chen approached Nora with a proposition. The elderly physician was considering retirement and wanted to sell her practice, including the small building in town where she saw patients. She offered to sell it to Nora for a price far below market value, to be paid over time. "You have the skills and the temperament," Dr. Chen said, "and you have been doing most of the work anyway these past few years. It is time the practice officially became yours." Nora was torn. It was an incredible opportunity, but the cost was still substantial even with Dr. Chen's generosity. She talked it over with Xander that evening, spreading the numbers out on their kitchen table and trying to make the finances work. "We should do it," Xander said without hesitation. "But we would be in debt for years," Nora protested. "All our savings would go to the down payment, and the monthly payments would be steep. We would have to give up the idea of buying land for a while." "So we give it up for a while," Xander said. "Nora, this is your calling. I have seen how you light up when you talk about medicine, how much it means to you to help people. If we have to tighten our belts for a few years to make it happen, then that is what we will do. We will make it work together." "You are sure?" Nora asked, searching his face. "I am sure," Xander said firmly. "You supported my dreams. Let me support yours." So Nora accepted Dr. Chen's offer, and in June of 1880 she became the official proprietor of the Grass Valley Medical Practice. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. She was now responsible not just for treating patients, but for running a business, managing supplies, keeping accounts. Xander helped however he could, taking over more of the household duties so Nora could focus on the practice. The first few months were brutal. Nora worked 12 and 14-hour days, taking every patient who came through the door because they needed the money. She treated everything from minor cuts to serious injuries, delivered babies, and sat vigil with the dying. Xander worried about her constantly, could see the exhaustion in the lines of her face and the way she sometimes fell asleep over supper. "You are going to work yourself to death," he said one night after she had come home near midnight from a difficult birth. "I am fine," Nora insisted, but she swayed on her feet as she said it. Xander caught her before she fell, scooping her up and carrying her to bed despite her protests. "You are not fine. You are running yourself into the ground, and I am putting my foot down. Tomorrow you are going to close the practice for a full day and rest, and we are going to figure out a better system because this is not sustainable." "We need the money," Nora said, tears of exhaustion leaking from her eyes. "We need you alive and healthy more," Xander replied. "What good is the practice if you collapse from exhaustion? We will figure out the money. We always do." True to his word, Xander made Nora rest the next day. He brought her breakfast in bed, ran a bath for her, and absolutely refused to let her go into town even when she insisted she felt fine. Instead, he sat with her on the front porch, and they talked through possible solutions. "What if you hired help?" Xander suggested. "Maybe a young woman who wants to learn nursing. She could handle the simpler cases and free you up for the more serious work. I cannot afford to pay anyone, Nora said. What about an apprenticeship? Someone willing to work for training instead of wages, at least at first. There must be girls in town who want something more than just marrying young and having babies. Nora considered this. It was actually a good idea. And she knew exactly who to ask. Lily Patterson was 16, bright and curious, and had been hanging around the practice for months asking questions whenever Nora would answer them. She came from a large, poor family and would likely jump at the chance for real training. Within a week, Lily Patterson became Nora's apprentice. The girl proved to be everything Nora had hoped for. Quick to learn, gentle with patience, and endlessly enthusiastic. With Lily handling the minor injuries and routine checkups, Nora was able to focus on the more complex cases. Her workload became more manageable, and slowly the practice began to turn a real profit. By their third anniversary in late 1881, they had paid down a significant chunk of the debt to Dr. Chen, and were actually managing to save a little each month. Nora had also discovered she was pregnant, a development that thrilled and terrified them both. "Are you happy?" Nora asked Xander one evening as they sat together on the porch, his hand resting on her still flat stomach. "Happier than I ever imagined possible," Xander said honestly. "Scared out of my mind, but happy." "Me too," Nora admitted. "What if I am a terrible mother? What if something goes wrong?" "You are going to be a wonderful mother," Xander said firmly. "You are patient and kind and so strong, and whatever happens, we will face it together." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the fall and winter. Nora worked as long as she could, finally turning the practice almost entirely over to Lily when she was 8 months along and could barely waddle around anymore. Xander fussed over her constantly, insisting she rest, bringing her endless cups of tea and books to keep her occupied. Their son was born on a stormy night in April 1882, coming into the world with a lusty cry that announced he was here and intended to be noticed. Xander wept when Dr. Chen placed the baby in his arms, tears streaming down his face as he looked at the tiny, perfect creature they had created. "He is beautiful," Xander whispered. "What should we name him?" They had discussed names endlessly but never quite settled on one. Now, looking at their son, Nora knew exactly what he should be called. "Thomas," she said softly. "Thomas Ranger Garrison, after the man I lost and the horse who brought me to you." Xander looked at her, more love in his eyes than she had ever seen. "That is perfect. Hello, Thomas." "Welcome to the world, little man." Being parents was harder than either of them anticipated. Thomas was colicky and rarely slept more than 2 hours at a stretch. Nora was exhausted from the birth and from trying to keep up with nursing, and Xander was trying to work full days at the mill while also helping with the baby at night. They stumbled through those first few months in a haze of sleeplessness and dirty diapers, snapping at each other sometimes from sheer exhaustion. But they also experienced moments of pure transcendent joy the first time Thomas smiled, a real smile and not just gas. The way he would calm instantly when Xander held him and sang old trail songs in his rough voice. The weight of him sleeping on Nora's chest, trusting and peaceful. "I had forgotten what this feels like," Xander said one night, holding Thomas while Nora tried to eat supper without falling asleep in her plate. "Having something that depends on me completely, it is terrifying." "But also wonderful," Nora added. "Also wonderful," Xander agreed. "Makes me think of Ranger sometimes, how he trusted me to take care of him, to make the right decisions, how I would have done anything to keep him safe." "You did keep him safe," Nora said gently. "For 13 years you gave him a good life, and you are going to give Thomas a good life too." "We both are." As Thomas grew from infant to toddler, The rhythm of their lives settled into something sustainable. Nora returned to work at the practice part-time, with Lily now fully capable of handling most routine cases. Xander had been promoted at the mill and was now a shift supervisor, which came with better pay and slightly more reasonable hours. They hired a neighbor girl named Amy to help with Thomas during the days when both Nora and Xander were working. Thomas proved to be a happy child, curious about everything and fearless in ways that gave his parents heart attacks. He started walking at 10 months and was running by 11, constantly getting into trouble and keeping them on their toes. He had Xander's dark hair and gray eyes, but Nora's smile and determination. On Thomas's second birthday in April 1884, they threw a party in the yard with neighbors and friends. As Nora watched Xander help their son blow out his candles, both their faces lit by the glow of the flames, she felt a contentment so profound it brought tears to her eyes. "You all right?" Margaret Chen asked quietly. The old doctor was technically retired now, but still came to every social event she was invited to. "More than all right," Nora said. "Just realizing how much my life has changed since I moved to Grass Valley, how much better it is than I ever dreamed possible." "You have built something good here," Margaret said approvingly, "both of you. A good marriage, a thriving practice, a beautiful child. You should be proud." "I am," Nora said, "and grateful, so grateful." That summer they finally had enough saved to buy a piece of land. It was only 3 acres on the outskirts of town, but it was theirs, paid for in cash with no debt. Xander walked the property line with Thomas on his shoulders, pointing out where they would build a barn, where they would plant crops, where maybe someday they would have a few horses. "Horses," Thomas repeated, one of his favorite words. He was obsessed with them, wanted to see them and touch them every chance he got. "Maybe next year we will get you a pony," Xander told him, and Thomas shrieked with delight. Later, after Thomas was in bed, Nora found Xander standing at the edge of their new property, looking out at the setting sun. She came up behind him and wrapped her arms around his waist, resting her cheek against his back. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "About how far I have come," Xander said quietly. 6 years ago I was at the lowest point of my life, had lost everything that mattered to me, and now look at where I am. I have you, I have Thomas, I have this land. I have a life I am proud of." "We have a life we are proud of," Nora corrected. "We built this together." "We did," Xander agreed. He turned in her arms and kissed her softly. "And I want to keep building. More children if you are willing. A real home on this land. Maybe even those horses I used to dream about." "I am willing," Nora said. "For all of it." Their daughter was born in the winter of 1886, arriving during a cold snap that had everyone in Grass Valley huddled by their fires. She was smaller than Thomas had been, with wisps of red-gold hair that neither parent could account for, until Xander remembered his grandmother had been a redhead. "What should we name her?" Xander asked, cradling his daughter with the same tenderness he had shown Thomas. "I was thinking Rose," Nora said. "Rose Margaret after Dr. Chen. She saved my life once when I had the influenza 2 winters ago, and I would like to honor her." "Rose Margaret Garrison," Xander said, testing the name. "I like it. Welcome to the family, little Rose." Rose proved to be very different from her brother. Where Thomas was loud and energetic, Rose was quiet and contemplative. She watched everything with solemn green eyes that seemed to see more than an infant should. As she grew, she was the one who wanted to sit and look at books, who would play quietly for hours while Thomas ran wild. "She is going to be a scholar," Nora predicted when Rose was 2 and already showing signs of being able to recognize letters. "As long as she is happy," Xander said, but he beamed with pride whenever Rose showed off her learning. Thomas, now 4, was obsessed with his little sister. He appointed himself her protector, always making sure she had toys to play with and getting upset if anyone made her cry. The two of them were inseparable, and watching them play together made Nora's heart swell. By 1888, life had settled into a comfortable pattern. The medical practice was thriving, with Lily now a full partner and talking about one day taking it over completely when Nora was ready to step back. Xander had left the mill and was now working their land full-time, growing vegetables and hay to sell in town. He had also bought 2 horses, fulfilling his old dream, and was starting to get a reputation as someone who could train difficult animals with patience and kindness. Thomas, at 6, spent every spare moment helping his father with the horses. Xander taught him to ride, to brush and care for the animals, to understand their moods and needs. Watching them together, Nora sometimes thought about Ranger, about how that long-ago grief had brought them to this moment of joy. One evening in late summer, after the children were in bed, Nora and Xander walked out to where their original property bordered the new land. There, under the old oak tree where Ranger was buried, Xander knelt and cleared away some weeds that had grown up around the grave marker. "Do you still think about him?" Nora asked softly. "Every day," Xander admitted. "Not with the same raw grief, but with gratitude. He gave me 13 years of faithful service, and his death brought me to you. I like to think he would be happy about how things turned out." "I think he would too," Nora said. She knelt beside Xander, just as she had that first evening 6 years ago. "You know what Thomas asked me the other day? He wanted to know if people and animals go to the same heaven. I told him I did not know for sure, but I hoped they did." "Me too," Xander said. He traced the carved letters on the marker, his fingers gentle. "I hope wherever Ranger is, he knows what he did for me, how he saved my life by bringing me to you." They sat there in the fading light, hands clasped, comfortable in the silence. Around them, their life spread out in all directions: the house they had built, the land they worked, the children sleeping peacefully. It was not a grand or glamorous life, but it was theirs, hard-won and deeply loved. "Thank you," Xander said suddenly, turning to Nora with the same intensity he had shown that first night. "For stopping, for staying, for building this life with me." "Thank you for letting me," Nora replied. "For opening your heart even when it was broken, for trusting me with it." They walked back to the house hand in hand, their shadows long in the sunset. Inside, the children slept and the fire in the hearth burned low. Tomorrow would bring work and worry, as all tomorrows did, but tonight they had each other and the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived. The years continued to flow by like water, marked by both joys and challenges. In 1890, their second son was born, a robust baby they named Samuel after Xander's father. He had Nora's darker coloring and a personality that seemed to combine the best of both his older siblings, Thomas's energy and Rose's thoughtfulness. That same year, Bill Cooper retired from the mill and offered Xander a partnership in a new venture. He wanted to start a horse breeding and training operation, and he needed someone with Xander's skills and reputation. It was a risk, leaving the security of farming to start something new, but after long discussions, Nora and Xander decided to take the chance. The horse operation started small, just a handful of animals and a barn Bill had built on his property. But word spread quickly about the quality of their horses and the gentleness of Xander's training methods. Within 2 years, they were breeding some of the finest working horses in that part of California, and people came from as far as Sacramento to buy from them. Thomas, now 8, was his father's constant shadow in the business. He had inherited Xander's natural gift with horses, that ability to read their moods and communicate with them in ways that seemed almost magical. Rose, at 4, preferred to spend time at the medical practice with her mother, carefully organizing supplies and asking endless questions about the human body and how to heal it. Samuel, still a toddler, seemed content to toddle between both worlds, equally happy petting horses or playing with the medical equipment Nora brought home. The prosperity the horse business brought allowed them to pay off the last of their debts and start putting away real savings. They added rooms to the house, built a proper barn on their own property to supplement Bill's facilities, and even hired help so they were not quite so stretched thin. But success also brought its own challenges. In the spring of 1893, a competitor accused Xander of stealing one of his horses to use for breeding. The accusation was completely false. Xander had bought the horse legitimately from a different rancher, but it still required a court case to resolve. The stress of the trial, the whispers and speculation around town, took a toll on the whole family. What if they believe him? Xander asked the night before the trial. They were lying in bed, Nora's head on his chest as he stared at the ceiling. What if everything we have built just crumbles because of lies? Then we will build again, Nora said firmly. We have done it before, but it is not going to come to that. The truth is on our side and we have the documentation to prove it. She was right. The case was thrown out after Xander produced a bill of sale and testimony from 3 witnesses who had been present at the purchase. The judge was scathing in his dismissal, suggesting the competitor should be ashamed of wasting the court's time with baseless accusations. Xander and Nora left the courthouse vindicated, but the experience left them both shaken. I have never had someone lie about me like that, Xander said that evening. They were sitting on the porch, watching the children play in the yard. Try to ruin my reputation, take away everything I have worked for. It made me realize how fragile all of this is. Nothing worth having is not fragile, Nora said. We protect what we love by living with integrity, by treating people right, by being good stewards of what we have been given. That is all we can do. When did you get so wise? Xander asked, managing a small smile. I learned from my husband, Nora said, kissing his cheek. A man who taught me that grief and loss do not have to make us hard, that staying soft and open is its own kind of courage. The incident with the false accusation actually ended up helping their business in the long run. Many people in the community were disgusted by the competitor's behavior and made a point of buying from Xander instead. Within a year, the competitor had gone out of business, while Xander and Bill's operation was more successful than ever. In 1895, tragedy struck when Bill Cooper died suddenly of a heart attack. He was only 53, seemingly healthy one moment and gone the next. His death hit Xander hard, bringing back echoes of the grief he had felt over Ranger all those years ago. But now he had Nora and the children to help him through it, to remind him that loss was part of life, but so was love. Bill left his half of the business to Xander in his will, a gesture of trust and friendship that Xander treasured. He renamed the Operation Garrison and Cooper's Horse Ranch in Bill's honor, and he made sure Bill's widow received a portion of the profits for the rest of her life. Thomas was 13 now, strong and capable and desperate to leave school and work the ranch full-time. Nora insisted he finish at least through the 8th grade, but she knew that ranching was in his blood the way medicine was in hers. Rose, at 9, was already talking about becoming a doctor, studying her mother's medical books with an intensity that sometimes worried Nora. Let her find her passion, Xander advised. Just like we found ours, and if it is medicine, then we will do everything we can to help her achieve it. Samuel, at 5, remained the wild card. He loved the horses and he loved watching his mother work, but he also loved music. He had taught himself to play simple tunes on a battered harmonica they had bought him, and he would sit for hours making up songs. Nora suspected they had a musician on their hands, though time would tell. The turn of the century in 1900 found the Garrison family prosperous and happy. Xander was 45 now, with silver threading through his dark hair and laugh lines around his eyes. Nora was 44, still working part-time at the practice but increasingly content to let Lily handle most of the day-to-day operations. Their children were growing up strong and capable, each finding their own path. Thomas had taken over much of the day-to-day operations of the horse ranch, freeing Xander to focus on the training and breeding aspects he loved most. Rose had just been accepted to the nursing school in Sacramento, a program that would eventually allow her to pursue medical school if she chose. Samuel, at 10, was still figuring out his way, but seemed happy splitting his time between music and helping wherever he was needed. One evening in late summer, as the whole family sat on the expanded porch after supper, Nora looked around at the faces she loved most in the world and felt her eyes grow damp. "What is wrong, Mama?" Samuel asked, always the most attuned to emotions. "Nothing is wrong," Nora assured him. "I am just happy. Looking at all of you at this life we have built together and feeling grateful for every moment. Even the hard moments," Rose asked. At 15, she was old enough to remember some of the struggles, the lean years and the scary times. "Especially the hard moments," Nora said. "Because they taught us what we are made of. They showed us that we could face anything as long as we faced it together." Xander reached over and took her hand, squeezing gently. "Your mother is right. This family has been through a lot, but we have always come out stronger on the other side." "Tell us again how you met," Samuel asked. It was a family favorite, this story, one the children never tired of hearing. So Xander told it again, his voice soft in the gathering dusk. He told them about Ranger, the best horse that ever lived, and how his death had nearly broken Xander's spirit. He told them about kneeling at the grave at sundown, weeping with a grief so profound he thought he might drown in it. And then he told them about their mother, about how she had appeared like an angel in the fading light and knelt beside him in the dirt. How she had stayed when anyone else would have ridden on. How that simple act of compassion had saved his life and set him on the path to everything he held dear. "I think about that night often," Xander said, looking at Nora with the same love he had shown that first evening. "About what would have happened if you had not stopped. If you had decided my grief was not your concern, everything would be different. You children would not exist. This ranch would not exist. None of it would be here." "But I did stop," Nora said, "and I stayed. And I would make the same choice 1,000 times over because it brought me to this, to you, to our family, to this beautiful life." The children were quiet, absorbing this. Finally, Thomas spoke up. "Do you ever visit Ranger's grave? I know it is on our land, but I have never seen you go there." "I go sometimes," Xander admitted. "Usually alone, early in the morning before anyone else is up. I sit with him for a while and tell him about my life, about you kids, about the horses we raise. I like to think he knows somehow that he is proud of what came from his loss." "Can we go with you sometime?" Rose asked. "I would like to see where it all started." So the next morning, as the sun was just beginning to paint the sky in shades of rose and gold, the whole Garrison family walked out to the oak tree where Ranger was buried. The grave was still carefully maintained, the stones still in place, though the wooden marker had weathered to silver gray over the years. Xander knelt and placed his hand on the earth, and one by one his family joined him. Nora knelt on his right, just as she had that first evening 22 years ago. Thomas knelt on his left. Rose and Samuel completed the circle, all of them connected in that moment of remembrance and gratitude. "Thank you, Ranger," Xander said softly, "for everything you gave me." for carrying me faithfully, for leading me, even in your death, to the greatest gift of my life." They stayed there for a long time, the six of them, as the sun rose and painted the world in light. Birds sang in the oak tree above them, and somewhere in the distance, horses whinnied to greet the morning. The world was waking up, full of promise and possibility, and the Garrison family was part of it all, rooted in love and loss and the beautiful, complicated truth of what it meant to be alive. As they finally stood and walked back to the house hand in hand, Nora squeezed Xander's fingers. "Still happy?" she asked, echoing a question she had posed years ago. "Happier than I ever imagined possible," Xander replied, the same answer he had given then. "Every single day." The years continued their steady march, bringing with them the natural evolution of a family. Rose graduated from nursing school in 1903 with top honors, and surprised everyone by choosing to work alongside her mother rather than striking out on her own. The two women made an excellent team, their skills complementing each other perfectly, and the Grass Valley medical practice thrived under their joint leadership. Thomas married in 1905, a sweet-natured girl named Ellen from a neighboring ranch. They built a house on the edge of the Garrison property and immediately set about filling it with children. Their first son, named Xander after his grandfather, was born in 1906, followed by a daughter and then twin boys over the next 5 years. Thomas and Ellen took over the day-to-day operations of the horse ranch completely, allowing Xander to finally take a step back and enjoy something approaching retirement. Samuel, to no one's surprise, pursued music. He left Grass Valley in 1907 to study in San Francisco, and while Nora worried about him in the big city, he thrived there. He played in orchestras and composed his own pieces, making a modest but respectable living doing what he loved. He came home to visit often, always bringing new songs and stories about his adventures. Through it all, Nora and Xander remained the center around which the family orbited. Their love had only deepened with time, weathering the storms of life and emerging stronger for it. They had gray hair now and creaking joints, but when they looked at each other, they still saw the young people who had knelt together at a horse's grave in the fading light of a June evening. In the spring of 1910, Nora was preparing dinner when Xander came in from checking on the horses, a strange look on his face. "What is it?" she asked, wiping her hands on her apron. "Is something wrong?" "Nothing is wrong," Xander said slowly. "But I just realized it has been 32 years since Ranger died. 32 years since that night you found me at his grave, longer than I had him by more than twice over." "Time moves fast," Nora said, coming to slip her arms around his waist, "but I do not regret a single moment of it." "Neither do I," Xander said. He kissed the top of her head, breathing in the scent that was uniquely hers, still as intoxicating as it had been 3 decades ago. "I was just thinking maybe we should do something to mark the anniversary, something to honor where we started." "What did you have in mind?" Nora asked. "I am not sure yet," Xander admitted, "but I will figure it out." What he figured out was a family gathering at Ranger's grave, not unlike the one they had held years before, but bigger now. Thomas brought his wife and 4 children. Rose came with Lily, who had become more family than employee over the years. Samuel arrived from San Francisco with his new wife, Marion, a lovely violinist he had met in the orchestra. They all stood together as the sun set, forming a large circle around the old grave. Xander spoke, his voice carrying clearly in the evening air. 32 years ago, I buried the best horse I ever knew beneath this tree. I thought that night that my life was over, that I had nothing left to live for. I was wrong. That night was not an ending but a beginning, because that was the night I met Nora." He reached for his wife's hand, pulling her close. She knelt beside me in the dirt and stayed. That simple act of kindness changed the course of my entire existence. It led to our marriage, to our children, to our grandchildren. It led to this ranch and the medical practice, to friendships and love, and all the countless ways our lives have touched others. And it all started because Nora chose compassion over convenience, connection over comfort. Nora's eyes were wet with tears, and she could see she was not alone. Rose was openly weeping, and even Thomas, usually so stoic, had to wipe his eyes. "So I wanted us all here tonight," Xander continued, "to remember and honor where we came from. To acknowledge the grief and loss that are part of life, but also to celebrate the joy and love that can grow from even the darkest moments. Ranger was a good horse, and his death brought me the greatest blessing I have ever known. I hope wherever he is, he knows what his life and his death meant to me." They stood in silence for a moment, and then Samuel stepped forward with his violin. He played a piece he had composed specifically for this occasion, a melody that started sorrowful and haunting but gradually transformed into something triumphant and joyful. It was the story of their family in music, and by the time he finished, there was not a dry eye in the circle. As darkness fell and they made their way back to the house for the meal Nora had prepared, the grandchildren ran ahead, laughing and playing. Xander and Nora walked slowly, savoring the moment. "That was perfect," Nora said. "A perfect way to honor everything we have built." "I just wanted them to understand," Xander said, "that love and loss are not opposites. They are intertwined, part of the same thread. We do not get one without risking the other." "But the risk is always worth it," Nora added. "Always," Xander agreed. The years after that anniversary gathering seemed to pass even more quickly. Thomas and Ellen had 2 more children, bringing their total to 6. Rose finally married in 1913, a patient of hers named David, who had fallen in love with her steady competence and gentle humor. They settled in Grass Valley, and Rose continued her work at the medical practice, now training a new generation of nurses just as Dr. Chen and Nora had trained her. Samuel and Marion split their time between San Francisco and Grass Valley, coming home for long stretches in the summer when the symphony was not in session. They had 2 daughters who showed early musical talent, and the house was often filled with the sound of violin and piano practice. Xander finally stopped working the horse ranch entirely in 1915, at the age of 60. Thomas had things well in hand, and Xander was content to spend his days puttering around the garden, playing with his grandchildren, and sitting on the porch with Nora in the evenings. "We have earned this," Nora said one night as they rocked gently in their chairs, watching the sunset paint the sky. She was 60 now, her hair completely silver but still beautiful to Xander's eyes. "We have," Xander agreed. "Though I confess I never thought I would live to see 60, much less have the life I have had." "Any regrets?" Nora asked. Xander considered this seriously. "Only that we did not have more years. That time keeps moving and there is never enough of it, but regrets about the choices we made. About the life we built, not a single one." "Good," Nora said, reaching over to take his hand, "because I feel exactly the same way." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to emerge, still holding hands just as they had done thousands of times before. The house behind them was filled with the sounds of family grandchildren being put to bed, Thomas and Ellen discussing the next day's work, Rose and David laughing over something in the kitchen. It was chaos and noise and love, and it was perfect. In the spring of 1918, the influenza epidemic that was sweeping the nation reached Grass Valley. As a medical professional, Nora was on the front lines of trying to help, working impossible hours alongside Rose and Lily to care for the sick. Despite all precautions, Rose contracted the illness. For 10 terrible days, the family held vigil as she fought for her life, her husband David never leaving her bedside. Nora had never felt so helpless. This was her daughter, her firstborn girl, and all her medical knowledge could not guarantee she would survive. She sat with Rose when David needed to rest, wiping her fevered brow and whispering prayers to any deity who might listen. Xander was her rock through it all, making sure she ate and slept, holding her when she broke down in tears, reminding her that they had faced hard things before and survived. "Rose is strong," he kept saying. "She gets that from you. She is going to pull through this." And miraculously, she did. On the 11th day, Rose's fever broke and she began the slow climb back to health. The relief was so profound that Nora collapsed in David's arms, weeping with gratitude and exhaustion. They had come so close to losing her, too close, and the experience left them all shaken. But it also reinforced what Xander had said at Ranger's grave 8 years earlier, that life was precious and fragile, that love always carried the risk of loss, but that the risk was worth it. Every single time. The 1920s brought relative peace and prosperity. The horse ranch continued to thrive under Thomas's management, now with his own sons helping him. Rose fully recovered and threw herself back into medical work with renewed passion. Samuel had become well known in San Francisco musical circles and was regularly commissioned to write new compositions. The family continued to grow as grandchildren married and great-grandchildren began to arrive. Through it all, Nora and Xander remained the foundation, their love story a legend in Grass Valley. People would point them out on their evening walks and tell their children, "That is Xander and Nora Garrison. Been together near 50 years now. Met when he was grieving his horse and she stopped to comfort him. True love, that is." In June of 1928, exactly 50 years after that fateful evening at Ranger's grave, the family threw a massive celebration. The entire town was invited, and it seemed everyone came. Tables were set up in the yard, overflowing with food. Music played, Samuel and Marion performing, joined by their now adult daughters. Children of multiple generations ran wild, playing tag and climbing trees. At the center of it all sat Xander and Nora, both now in their 70s, their hands clasped between them as they watched the celebration unfold. They had both lived longer than they had expected, had been blessed with more joy than seemed reasonable for one lifetime. They were slower now, their bodies showing the inevitable wear of time, but their minds were sharp, and their love was undiminished. As the sun began to set, casting that same golden light that had illuminated their first meeting, Xander stood with some effort and raised his hands for attention. The crowd quieted, turning to face him. 50 years ago tonight, Xander began, his voice still strong despite his age. I was kneeling at a grave, certain my life was over. I had lost my horse, lost my job, lost my purpose. I was ready to give up on everything. He looked down at Nora, who smiled up at him through tears. And then this woman, this incredible woman, she stopped. She did not have to. She could have kept riding, minded her own business, left me to my grief. But she did not. She knelt beside me in the dirt and she stayed. And in staying, she saved my life. Xander's voice cracked and he had to pause to collect himself. Thomas stepped forward, ready to support his father if needed, but Xander waved him back. 50 years, he continued. 50 years of marriage, 3 children, 12 grandchildren. 6 great-grandchildren so far, with more on the way. A successful ranch, a thriving medical practice, a family that extends beyond blood to include all of you. He gestured at the assembled crowd. All of this because one woman chose kindness, chose compassion. chose to kneel beside a stranger and bear witness to his pain. So tonight, we are not just celebrating our marriage. We are celebrating every choice, every moment of grace, every time someone chooses connection over isolation. Because those choices ripple out in ways we cannot imagine. They change lives. They change everything. The crowd erupted in applause and cheers. Nora stood, and Xander pulled her into his arms, kissing her as thoroughly as he had on their wedding day 50 years earlier. People whooped and hollered, and somewhere Samuel started playing their song on his violin, the one he had composed for that anniversary at Ranger's grave. Xander and Nora danced slowly in the fading light, surrounded by everyone they loved, and it was perfect. Absolutely perfect. As the evening wore on and guests began to depart, the family gathered one last time at Ranger's grave. It had become tradition now, this pilgrimage to where it all started. The wooden marker had long since been replaced with a stone one, carefully carved with the same words Xander had originally written. "Thank you," Xander said softly, his hand on the stone. "For everything. For bringing me here to this moment, to this life. I hope you know how much it all meant. How much it still means." Nora knelt beside him, just as she had done 50 years ago, and placed her own hand on the stone. "Thank you for me too," she said. "For trusting Xander, for carrying him faithfully, for leaving him in a place where I could find him. You gave me the great love of my life." Their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren knelt around them, forming a circle that had grown impossibly large from that first evening when it had been just two people and a grief that seemed insurmountable. But love did that, Nora thought. It multiplied. It expanded. It took sorrow and transformed it into something beautiful. They walked back to the house together as stars filled the sky, Xander and Nora moving slowly but steady, surrounded by the family they had built from tears and dirt and stubborn hope. Inside, there would be more food and more laughter, more stories and more music. There would be life in all its messy, complicated glory. But for just this moment, walking through the darkness hand in hand, Nora and Xander were transported back to that first evening. To the moment when everything changed, to when she knelt beside him and stayed. "I love you," Xander said, the same words he had spoken thousands of times over 50 years. "I love you too," Nora replied, the same answer she had given every single time, always and forever. And there, under the stars that had witnessed their beginning and would eventually witness their ending, Xander Garrison kissed his wife and thanked whatever forces in the universe had brought him to that grave on that evening in June of 1878. Had brought him to his lowest moment so that he could experience his highest joy. The years after their 50th anniversary were golden and sweet, filled with the richness of a life well lived. Xander and Nora moved more slowly now, their bodies finally betraying the weight of their years, but their spirits remained strong. They spent their days in simple pleasures, sitting on the porch, working in the garden, visiting with the seemingly endless stream of children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who were always stopping by. In the fall of 1932, Xander fell ill with pneumonia. At 77, his body simply did not have the strength to fight it off the way he might have when he was younger. For 2 weeks, Nora nursed him with all the skill and determination she possessed, but she knew from the beginning how this would likely end. She had been a nurse for nearly 60 years. She knew when medicine could help and when it could only ease the inevitable. On a cool October evening, as the light was fading to that same golden amber that had illuminated their first meeting, Xander asked Nora to help him sit up so he could look out the window. She propped pillows behind him and settled beside him on the bed, her hand in his. "It is a beautiful evening," Xander said, his voice weak but peaceful. "It is," Nora agreed, though her heart was breaking. She knew what was coming, could feel it in the way his breathing had changed, in the quietness that had settled over him. "Nora," Xander said, turning to look at her. Even now, weak and dying, his eyes still held that storm-gray intensity that had captivated her from the first. "Thank you for stopping that day, for staying, for giving me 54 years of happiness I never dreamed possible. You gave them to me too," Nora said through her tears. "You gave me everything. Will you do something for me?" Xander asked. "After I am gone, will you bury me beside Ranger? I want to rest where it all began." "Of course," Nora promised. "Whatever you want." Xander smiled, that rare full smile that still had the power to make her breath catch. "I am not afraid," he said. "I have had a good life, more than good. I got to love you and be loved by you. I got to see our children grow up, got to hold our grandchildren and great-grandchildren. I got to build something meaningful. What more could anyone ask for?" "Stay with me a little longer," Nora whispered. "Please." "I would if I could," Xander said. He raised her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "But it is time. And Nora, when your time comes, whether that is tomorrow or 20 years from now, do not mourn too long. Remember the joy. Remember the love. Remember that we were blessed." "I will," Nora promised. "I will remember all of it." Xander laid his head back on the pillows, his eyes drifting closed. "I can see him," he said softly. "Ranger. He is there, waiting, still faithful after all these years." And then, as the sun finally set and darkness crept across the land, Xander Garrison took his last breath. His hand went slack in Nora's, and the man who had saved himself by allowing himself to be saved was gone. Nora sat with him for a long time, holding his hand, memorizing his face one last time. She wept, but quietly, the tears of someone who had known this was coming and had already begun the long process of letting go. Around her, the house was quiet. The family had said their goodbyes over the past few days and were now in the front rooms, giving her this final private moment with her husband. Finally, she leaned forward and kissed his forehead. "Thank you," she whispered, "for 13 years with Ranger and 54 with me. Thank you for your tears and your laughter, for your strength and your vulnerability. Thank you for being exactly who you were. I will love you until my dying day, and beyond if such things are possible." She stood, smoothing his hair one last time, and then went to tell the family that he was gone. True to her promise, they buried Xander beside Ranger beneath the oak tree. It was a huge funeral. The church could not hold everyone who wanted to pay their respects, so they held the service outdoors. People spoke of Xander's kindness, his integrity, his skill with horses, and his devotion to family. They spoke of the legacy he left in his children and grandchildren, in the ranch that still bore his name, in the countless lives he had touched through his quiet goodness. And they spoke of his love for Nora, a love that had become legendary in Grass Valley. How she had found him at his lowest and lifted him up. How they had built a life together that stood as a testament to what was possible when two people committed fully to each other. Nora stood at his graveside, surrounded by their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and felt both bereft and blessed. He was gone, the man who had been her partner and her love for more than half a century. But he had left her with so much: the family, the memories, the absolute certainty that she had been truly, deeply loved. After the service, after everyone had gone home, Nora walked back to the two graves beneath the oak tree. She stood between them, one hand on each stone, connecting the two souls who had shaped her entire adult life. "Take care of each other," she said softly. "And do not worry about me. I will be all right. You taught me how to be strong, both of you. I will carry you with me until we meet again." Nora lived for 7 more years after Xander's death, years that were quieter but not unhappy. She was surrounded by family, still sharp-minded and engaged with the world around her. She worked at the medical practice until she was 80, finally retiring only when her hands became too unsteady for delicate work. She spent her days with her great-grandchildren, telling them stories about their great-grandfather, about the horse who had brought them all together, about the power of stopping when you saw someone in pain. She never remarried, never even considered it. Xander had been her great love, and she was content to live out her remaining years wrapped in the memory of what they had shared. On a warm evening in June 1939, 61 years to the day after she had first knelt beside Xander at Ranger's grave, Nora Thorne Garrison died peacefully in her sleep. She was 84 years old, surrounded by photos of everyone she had loved, with Xander's letter to her from their honeymoon pressed against her heart. They buried her between Xander and Ranger, her final resting place connecting the two graves as she had connected them in life. The stone was simple, listing her name and dates in a single line. She stopped. She stayed. She loved. The Garrison family continued to thrive in the decades that followed. Thomas ran the ranch until his own death in 1955, and then his sons took over and then their sons after them. Rose's descendants became doctors and nurses and healers, carrying on Nora's legacy of compassionate care. Samuel's great-grandchildren played music in symphony halls around the world, their talent a gift that kept on giving through the generations. And every year, on the anniversary of that first meeting, the family gathered at the three graves beneath the oak tree. They told the story again to the newest generation about Xander and his faithful horse Ranger, about Nora who had stopped and stayed, about the love that had grown from grief and loss into something beautiful and lasting. The story became a touchstone, a reminder of what mattered. That compassion changes lives. That staying with someone in their darkest moment can alter the course of everything that follows. That love is always worth the risk, always worth the pain, because the alternative a life lived in isolation and fear is no life at all. The oak tree still stands, gnarled and ancient now, its branches spreading wide to shelter the three graves beneath it. And on certain evenings, when the light is just right and the world is quiet, locals swear you can see them there, a man, a woman, and a horse, together again in the golden amber light of sunset, bound by love that transcended death and time and all the small sorrows that make up a human life. Because in the end, that was what mattered. Not the wealth they accumulated or the status they achieved, not the challenges they faced or the obstacles they overcame. What mattered was that they loved each other, fully and completely, for better or worse, in sickness and health, from that first evening when she knelt in the dirt until their final breaths and beyond. She found the cowboy weeping over his horse's grave at sundown. She knelt beside him and stayed. And in staying, she gave him the greatest gift anyone can give another person, the knowledge that they are not alone, that they are seen and valued and loved. It was enough. More than enough. It was everything.